Thank you very much, Johan. And good evening, everybody, from nighttime New Zealand. My name is Sarath. I'll be taking you through this presentation today. The presentation is on the wide world of logs, a way to monitor your resources in the cloud. This is a solution I've implemented at one of my clients that looks at monitoring your Azure Data Factory jobs and pipelines. And by the end of this presentation, I am looking forward to giving you a solution that I've built that you can implement, or a potential solution that you can consider when you're looking at building your own monitoring solutions for your Azure Data Factory pipelines or your data warehouses. Okay. Before we get started, if I can get my mouse to work, just a quick agenda for today. So basically, I'll through some introductions, who I am, that sort of thing. A quick background of the problem that I faced when I started this particular project. A sample of the solutions that I've built. Then we'll go through Azure Log Analytics. Then we'll cover custom query language, and then I'll take you through a demo. Finally, we'll just look at some cost considerations that I had to consider when I was trying to build this, and then we'll take go through some summary and questions at the end as well. As Johan said, I'm happy to have take any questions as they come along, time permitting, and I'll address them as we go. Okay, so with that out of the way, first thing about me. As I said, my name is Sarath. I work as a data strategist and a cloud architect. I'm certified in both Microsoft and Google. I organize the Asia Pacific AI meetup group. I'm based out of Brisbane. I pretty much read any science fiction books that are out there, and my sport of choice is cricket, being Indian. And I watch other sports as well. If you want to get in touch with me, best way is one of those channels. I've got a LinkedIn site. Obviously, I am on Twitter. I do have a blog site that I try to blog, but it's fairly intermittent. And I do maintain a GitHub site as well, where I write my code. And I don't know why my mouse is doing that. Okay. So I come to the problem statement. So basically, I'll go through why I started this particular piece of work and why I wanted to look at monitoring. At the start of this year, I got put onto a greenfields project that had been running for a couple of years. Okay? So somebody had gone in, built solutions for the client because the client requested it. They didn't have any monitoring in place. So when I turned up and there were issues, we had to actually go into the code, troubleshoot it every single time. Go into Data Factory, find particular objects that we wanted, see what it was doing. Apart from that, I didn't have a high-level view of how many pipelines there were, how they were being executed, how do I actually do estimations, that sort of thing. So I wanted to get that metric as well. What also happened at the start of the year, or midway through the year, is the number of resources on the project started to reduce. So we started off with about 3 resources, and by the end of that 3-month period, it was down to me. And basically, I was finding that I was spending way too much time trying to actually find code that was actually erroring out rather than having that at the tip of my hands. Okay. Now, basically, because of the resource crunch, I found that I couldn't spend too much time on actually building this solution, because I had other mission critical databases and reports to get out of the way or implement. And I wanted to make it, so what I said, looked at it was, I will develop something. I want to make it repeatable across different clients, anybody who's in the cloud, and I don't want to recreate this, recreate the wheel, as it were. And I wanted to minimize the cost for doing this. Like I said, it was just me. This was basically done in my free time. I didn't want to get in another resource because we didn't have the budget. So yeah, that's one main reason that I looked at this solution. Okay, so what is the solution? So if you look at the first example that I built, it's pretty much basic. So it gives you the number of pipelines by data factory. Okay, in my instance, I only have one data factory. I've got 668 pipeline executions in that data factory within a set period. Okay. Now, this number in and of itself isn't that useful, but at least it's getting the ball rolling. I can use this to do estimations going forward. Okay, so once I had this, then I thought, well, I'm getting this information anyway, so what are my pipelines actually doing, right? Because in traditional data warehouse audit tables or monitoring tables, you had that same sort of scenario, correct? So you wanted to look at what your ETL packages were doing, how the executions were differing, whether the execution trends were going up, down, is it fairly static? That's what I wanted to implement. Okay, in the next example, I've done something similar. Okay, in fact, to that. So I've got pipeline runs trends. So these are all my Azure Data Factory pipelines. As you can see, I've got pipelines that have succeeded, failed, or queued, okay, that haven't run yet. Now, as you can see, one of the succeeded ones as an example is it just sends a processing email, executed six times within a day. As you can see, it spikes at certain points in the day, and it's relatively even spread. So I know that's kind of working. The refresh Power BI dataset as another example. That runs a lot more often. And the reason it runs a lot more often is we've got that built into most of our pipelines. But as you can see, I've got higher spikes at certain runs and lower spike at certain runs. So straight away, I was able to identify what the execution time window was for each of my pipelines without actually going into the code and digging through it. Okay. Now looking at this data, it looks high execution times for these, but that's because we have more data volumes coming through. And as well, you can see that I've got a couple that failed. Compared to these, they failed relatively quickly. Then I could go in and have a look what happened. Could it be a Microsoft networking issue? Could it be something with a data set, that sort of thing? In this particular instance, it was a data problem. Okay. I don't know why my mouse wants to do this. Okay. Anyway, so next one is a data flow. So we run a Power BI premium environment. So again, it looks at the executions of these Power BI data flows, how many times it's running, what the execution window is like, which is good at a very high level to see what your pipelines were doing. The next question we had was, or I had, was how are these pipelines getting triggered? How many triggers do we actually have, and what type of triggers are they, right? So again, I didn't want to go into data factories separately and look for them one by one. So the next thing I did was I had to look at trigger runs by data factory. Again, I only have one data factory here, but I've got 61 triggers or 61 pipelines that are triggered. Now you can see straight away how useful this will be if you have multiple environments, right? So you can tell at a glance what your environments are doing and what they're triggering on. Okay. So if you look at this environment, for example, 61 triggers for one environment. Yeah. If you have the same sort of thing in multiple environments, it'll balloon out. So you can manage your costs that way. Next thing I said was, okay, I've got so many triggers. What's actually happening with these triggers? How often are these triggers executing, and what are they? And this led me down to this particular example here, which basically says I've got one data factory pipeline. It gets executed 16 times a day, and it's based off the transaction event trigger. Okay, and I can see the trigger times are relatively straightforward. During the day, it gets triggered at set times. There's no particular mystery here. I've got 12 pipelines that get executed daily. I've got 2 pipelines that execute at 4 a.m. You get the idea. Okay. One benefit of something like this is I can potentially take this to my clients and say, look, this is what is happening in my environment. So there's no more need for me to actually maintain a separate documentation spreadsheet. It's a living piece of work that you can share potentially. Okay, and I'll come to why I say potentially in just a minute as well. Now, I had a look at triggers. Then I said, look, I've got so many triggers, they're executing, which is all fine. Well, what are my pipelines actually doing? What is actually taking me the most time to run? Which led me down to this particular example here, which is the top 3 pipelines by duration. Okay. As you can see, I've got 3 pipelines here. The first one being flat files to SQL. I've got production loads and contact tracing loads. As you can see, that takes about 2 hours to run. Okay, basically, which gave me a clue to start looking and saying, what is the actual problem? Similar with these 3. Now, the reason why this one takes a long time to run is it runs a lot of reference data loads and a whole bunch of other processing jobs in the background. So it basically waits. And most of my wait time is included in this. Similar to my load production data, right? So the load of the data into the database is relatively small, but we had wait times built into our Power BI refreshes just to account for variations and dependencies, and that is causing this to balloon out. Now, as a final exercise, in my scenarios, I wanted to see what the activities were doing, right? And that is to facilitate me looking and seeing why these were taking so long to run, which is why I built this. So this is looking at each activity. So as you can see in this list, I've got a wait activity that runs almost 900 times, runs fairly often. There is certain spikes here based on certain things, and it executes. Same sort of thing with Azure Data Factory, data flows especially. So as you can see, these wait times or these execution times kind of mirrors what you have in your Azure Data Factory load in wait times here. And this kind of led me to believe, well, I've got waits set up, so that must be what is causing it. Okay. So straight away from this, you can see that it's very useful to have something like this that you can take to your client. Now, one of the cool things that you do also see is if you hover over these lines, you will get data that underpins this. So where I've got my mouse here at the moment, I've got one that takes about 2 seconds, 5 seconds, then it doesn't run. So as you can see, these are the execution times. All right. So with those examples, what I'll do next is I'll show you how I built these and what are the technology profiles I used to get this started. Okay, so like I said, I didn't want to create a custom solution. I wanted something out of the box. So what I ended up doing was using Azure Log Analytics. And the reason for that is twofold. One was I was playing around with Azure Log Analytics at the time. And the second was I had looked at, when I was doing my research into Log Analytics, I found a pre-built solution that Microsoft provides on their marketplace that gives you some of that base data that I was showing you earlier. And moving on, I've actually built a couple more complex examples, and I'll get to that in my demo. Okay, so with Azure Log Analytics, so what is it? Right? It's basically a tool in the cloud that Microsoft provides for you to collect information and run queries. One good thing about it is, Azure Log Analytics runs on top of Azure Monitor. It creates a Log Analytics agent, but you're not actually charged for any data that you push into Log Analytics. There is a cost involved, and I'll get to that shortly. Okay. What it allows you to do, Azure Monitor and Log Analytics combined, is collect data from different resources, not just Azure Data Factory. So you can do SQL Server, you can do VMs, you can do networking information, you can do security, anything like that can go into Log Analytics. Okay. It is something that's based on Azure Data Explorer. Azure Data Explorer pretty much covers writing queries against big data sets and is run using custom query language. For the purposes of this presentation, I won't be going into looking at Azure Data Explorer for now, but feel free to have a look at that at a later point. Okay, custom query language. What is KQL? Okay, so custom query language is pretty much a language based like I said earlier, from Azure Data Explorer, and is used to write queries for big data sets. It's a read-only request that it sends, and it returns results. What that means for us as data professionals, it uses schema entities similar to SQL. So it uses databases, tables, and columns. So it's relatively easy to understand once you know SQL. Okay, or at least you can start learning, KQL and translate between SQL and KQL. As an example, I've got a couple here. So the first one is pretty much saying I've got a table, which is the ADF pipeline run, and I want to return data where the start time for the collection of this data is about 2 days ago. Okay. As you can see, it's not a very complex query. It's pretty much doing a select start from this table and using a predicate of where. Okay. Now let me take you to a more complex query. Now this is remembered I wrote a query earlier that had a max pipeline duration, trends basically. So this is how I built it. So I've got a table, which is a pipeline run. I get the duration of my logs, which is about 2 days ago, or from 2 days ago, where all my queries are not in progress. So they have either succeeded, failed, or they're in queue to process. I get the total duration in minutes. I get the max duration by name, and then I get the top 3. Okay. So looking at this query, I hope you can understand how you can translate this pretty effectively to SQL if you had to, right? So writing KQL queries is not in and of itself difficult, at least for some for the simple solutions I've shown you so far. Okay, so what I did to actually turn on some of that auditing information. So if you go into Azure Data Factory and go into the diagnostic settings, you will get these options here. Okay, and I'll take you through these diagnostic settings when I start my demo as well. So if you look at it, there's a lot of information that you can actually send from Azure Data Factory to a log analytics environment. And so you can send your activity runs, pipelines information, trigger information. You can send anything about your SSIS packages that you run, if you're running those in Azure Data Factory. And you can output those into multiple buckets. You can send them to log analytics workspaces. You can send them to storage accounts, event hubs. You can also send them to a third-party solution if you had to. For this particular presentation, for my solution, I chose log analytics as my solution. You would potentially choose a storage account if you had massive amounts of data coming in into logs. One case in point being if you're writing data into Synapse Analytics, and from what I understand, Synapse actually produces copious amounts of data, which may not be feasible to send into log analytics. And I'll get to the reason for that shortly as well, okay? Or at least when I get to the cost section. So when you want to turn these on, I basically selected all of these for my solution. Feel free to just choose the ones you want. Okay, so I've selected those. I've set up my log analytics to capture data. What is next, right? So the data will be written to the logs as the pipelines are run. So as soon as you turn it on, there will not be any log analytics data. In my instance, it took overnight for the data to come through, just based on my trigger and my schedules of jobs. And like I said earlier, there is a pre-built solution available that looks at some of these metrics that I was showing you before. Are there any questions so far?
No questions so far.
Okay, perfect. In that case, I'll keep going. Okay, so now we get to the demo. I will take you through, like I said earlier, I'll take you through the solution that I've built. I'll show you how to run. Well, let's go through these, right? So I'll show you the audit reports that I've built in Power BI, and I'll explain why I've included Power BI in this presentation as well. I'll show you how to write queries in KQL. I'll show you how I actually got information about the pipelines using KQL as well for my reports. Then I'll take you through some triggers and why I've got queries about triggers. Then we'll have a look at activities and how to get activity information out. Then I'll take you through some complex queries that I've written. Then how do you take these queries and actually export them to Power BI as well? Okay, so I will give you a full view of what I did to build this solution. Okay, so with that in mind, then let me just switch over to my first report. Okay, so this is the Power BI report that I built. As you can see, it's a typical Power BI report. There's nothing special. It's a work in progress. So it's giving you information around pipelines, what the status is, when it started. One of the good things it does, it actually gives you the rows read, copied, how much megabytes it was, what the status was, duration, all the typical monitoring information that you'd be interested in as a data professional looking at a data warehouse. Okay. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to show you this, and one of the requests that we got from my client is to build something like this, is to take the Azure Data Factory's monitor window and the Gantt chart out of that and actually put that into Power BI and get people accessing this report to see what their pipelines are doing themselves. So self-service auditing or monitoring, rather than them reaching out to the IT department or your support staff or my support staff for this matter, and us trying to find what's happening. Somebody can log into the portal directly and look at this. Okay. Now, the second report that I've built is this one, which looks at ADF triggers. Now, the reason for this, right, is twofold. One, I wanted to understand what was happening in my environment. So like I said earlier, we've got 61 triggers or triggers that run. Some of those are based on blobs, some of them are time-based, and some of them would be event-based if you had event-based triggers. Now, when I initially started looking for documentation on this, we couldn't find any. And I started off documenting them in Excel manually. And again, I found that I was taking a bit too much time. I found I couldn't keep my focus and actually getting some of the stuff documented. My concern was, even if I did that in Excel, I couldn't make it a living document, and I wanted to do something like that, right? Now, as part of that, when I started looking at some of the metrics, I noticed there was triggered data coming through, that I had it available. As I look, okay, let's have a look and see what sort of information is available that we can get. So as you can see in this report, I've got pipelines, what they're invoked by, the triggers, and funnily enough, if they're a blob trigger, I've got the name of the file that's triggered it. Okay, so now I can pass this on to anybody in my team or into the clients to say, this is what is happening in your environment. If there is a problem, go and look at this file straight away. I do not need to dig. And since it's going to be available to the users, they can have a look at it themselves. Okay, so with those two solutions that I built out of the way, let's have a look at how I built it, right? So if I go into the first report here, which is the auditing report or the monitoring report, and let's have a look at transformed data. So if you look at this, I've got basically 3 tables in Power BI, or 3 data sets in Power BI. ADF audit and calendar tables, right? Calendar is your typical calendar entry, so I won't go through those. Thing to note of interest is the ADF audit. I've got something like this, right? So if you look at that, it pretty much looks like the query I was showing you earlier, right? In terms of, there's the table, there's the start time, and I've got some information coming out, okay? And as it says in the comments up here, it's basically a M query that I've taken out. It's all documented, it's all clean, it's all good. So I can pass this on to anybody. In a similar sort of way, and if you look at the audit information here, pipeline trigger information. Okay. Again, I've got 2 pipelines. I've got triggers and I've got pipelines. Now, the reason for this is I've wanted to create a joint data set. between these two to get me the information I was after. So looking at these as an example, and if I just go back, to my Power BI as an example quickly, okay, this is my model that I've created. Now, if you have additional data coming through, so for, say, for example, SQL Server information, you can basically tag it onto this as well directly, okay? And how I've created the join is basically based on the subscription ID. But so as you can see, there's not a lot of information that I needed to set up, and I'll show you why I haven't needed to set it up. But you can add multiple data sets like these to this and get your enterprise-wide solution in terms of monitoring your various resources. And hence why I said it's the wide world of logs in Azure. Okay, so now we've looked at the Power BI reports. Let's have a look at how I built them. Okay, so first thing you would need to do, as an example, right? Okay, is come into Azure Data Factory or Data Analytics on a query. In this particular instance, I'm just looking at activities, and I'm looking for anything that started in the last 2 days. Okay. And while that's running, let me have a quick look, and I'll show you how I actually set this up to start with. Okay. So if you look at Azure, your Azure environment, you want to turn on diagnostic settings for Azure Data Factory. You would go into your Data Factory blade here, go down to diagnostic settings, and once it loads, click on Azure Add Data Diagnostic Settings. You would turn all of these on. I turned on everything here, so metrics all the way up to activity runs. And like I said earlier, I sent it to Log Analytics Workspace, right, to start capturing information. Okay. So now that that's done and it's capturing information, let's have a look at, go back to this. Now I'll show you how easy it is to write a query, okay, in KQL. As you can see, I've got a whole bunch of tables down the left-hand side here. I've just copied one, which is ADF pipeline runs, and I click run, and it gives me data, right? Now, by default, if you just put the table name in, it'll put the where clause as the time range you've selected here. So it's interactive, so you can change it as you go. If you want a static query and you want to specify the time range, you need to do something like this. And as you can see, up here, when it says time range, it basically says it's set in my query. Okay, so now let's have a look at the data that we get back when we run this. As you can see, it's JSON formats. It's got embedded information, around various inputs and outputs. It's got error messages. It's got output information, resource IDs, etc. This is not very conducive to write a report against. And the reason I say that is it's not tabular, right? You've got to write custom code to actually get that out into the format you want, typically. I'll show you in a second how easy it is to actually get that information working in a format that you want, okay? Okay, so let's look at the pipeline information first. And let me just copy this query over. Okay. So this query here is looking at pipeline executions. Oops, that one. Let me just get the right one here. Just 1 second. Okay. Is that the right one? Okay, so what this is doing, if I'll just delete the so it's getting information from the pipeline table we looked at earlier. I'll come to what extend is in a second, and it's returning this information. So in this instance, let me run this. So it's giving me my resource ID, subscription, pipeline name, operations, and triggers. And as you can see, yes, I can still go down into different formats, but it's all flattened out for me. Okay, so as an example, if you look at that, I've got a whole bunch of information that I don't need in this query. Whereas here, I've got information coming through. And I'll show you why this is, I'll go get why I say this one's a better solution for what I'm doing, okay? So have a look at this column here called invoked by. So let's go back to this. So if we want to look at where my invoked by is coming from, it's underneath in this array, right? I want to get that information out. Now, how do I do that without writing custom, cursors and stuff like that to do it? Well, easy. What you do is write an extend statement. So what it's doing is basically taking that predecessor array we looked at before, making it a dynamic column. And basically all I have to do after that is say, I want to pass this JSON at the 0 entry. I want to get these two values out of it, right? So you've taken something complex, you've broken it down, and you're getting some data here. And this data you can use in any Power BI report. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Okay. So that's what I did to actually build a data set for my pipelines. Have a look at our triggers. Okay. So triggers, again, is the same sort of thing. So you're getting trigger information from the trigger table. You're doing extends on. Basically, if you look here, I've got two extend statements. Reason for that is I've got a dynamic array that's a parameters, which has some of the information that I want. In that parameters table or array, I've got an event payload, but that's also buried under another array. Okay? So I'm basically expanding those two arrays out to get to the information that I want. And that information is being returned here, as you can see. So if I run this, and of course it fails. Let me have a look why this one doesn't work. That's interesting. You know, vagaries of Microsoft and demo gods not working well for me. Okay, anyway, as you can see, I've got some basic information here. So I've got subscription information, resource IDs, I've got trigger names, and what is basically triggering on, right? So as you can see, this matches what I had in the Power BI report I was showing you earlier, right? And one of the things you'll notice is the data I'm returning includes a resource ID and subscription, okay? So you can use these two values to actually join any data set that you return from these queries. And you're getting a holistic view across your environment, like I was saying earlier. Okay, let's look at another complex query here. Okay, let's look at activities. So these are all my activities. I'll show you what they do. Right. So I've got activity runs the last 2 days, and I'm getting all this information out. And as you can see, I'm doing a whole bunch of aggregations as well. Okay, so it's not just breaking down of JSON components or JSON arrays that you can do. You can do pretty much aggregations, anything like that. You can also do joins between tables in KQL, but it's not something I'm going to cover as part of this demo. Okay. All right. So if I just go back quickly to this, so what I've gone through for the demo piece of this work is I've basically shown you how the audit reports work or what I've built. I've shown you how to write queries in KQL, how I write queries against pipelines, triggers, and activities. Now let me show you a different query. Okay, let me show you a more complex one. Now, like I was saying earlier, you can write queries against anything that is there in Azure Monitor or Log Analytics. Okay, I've shown you queries against Azure Data Factory. I've got one that runs against Azure SQL Database as well. And if I manage to get the right query, I'll give you that information. Okay. So this query is slightly different. So it's looking at diagnostics. It's giving me any security-related events for SQL Server. Obviously, it's looking for anything that's got an action RPC completed or a batch completed. and it's giving you that information. One of the interesting things to note, if I scroll to the right-hand side, I've got SQL queries that I can use. Okay, so you don't need to go into Management Studio or any other tool to get this information. You can get it directly from here. One other good thing about this is if you write any Power BI reports and they run against this database, I can still get the information from here because the diagnostic information is being captured. Okay, this is just an example. You know, you can break it out to write the query that you're after. Okay, so based on these 6 queries that I've written, you can see how easy and how quick it is to write your own queries in KQL, and how you can actually write and create your own monitoring solutions with minimal effort. So when I was building this, it took me about half a day to a day. That includes the Power BI reports to build. The majority of that time for me, time spent on that was for me to understand how these extend statements worked and to get to the right amount of detail in that array, right? So as you can see, I wrote this, and it's a perfectly good and legal, you know, a cost-effective way to and a powerful way to get you your solution that you want. And the added benefit, like I was saying earlier, is it doesn't have to be Azure Data Factory. It doesn't have to be just SQL Server. It can be an enterprise-wide solution that you can build. Okay. All right. Any questions about the demo so far? Take that as a no.
No, there's no questions so far.
Okay. So just coming back to the agenda then. So I've taken you through most of these things. A couple of things left. So one is how do we actually create Power BI reports out of them? And how do we actually get meaningful data sets out of these reports that I've built? Right. Now, if I go back to this, so say, for example, I've got this trigger information. I want to create a Power BI report. What do I do? Easy way. Go export. As you can see, you've got multiple options. You can export to Excel, Power BI. In my particular instance, I'm going to export it to mQuery. Open the file. As you can see, the query is written for you. Everything that you need is here. All you need to do is go copy. Okay. Go back in here. Just create a blank query and paste it in. That's your query done. So it's connected to your Azure environment. It's got the data that it needs. It runs the query that you've written, and it's good to go. The benefit and the beauty of this is now, if I want to deploy this report at another client, all I would need to do is connect to their environment. Okay, so it's locked behind your AD authentication, so nobody can come in and get data that they don't have access to. Right? And this is the reusability component that I was speaking earlier that I wanted to solve as part of my requirement. Okay. Obviously, then you'd go process, and it'll start processing that information for you. Okay. So what's next? Well, as I was building the solution, I wanted to understand what costs were involved. Like I said, I wanted to keep the costs to a minimum. When log analytics is involved, it's basically a pay-as-you-go model. Okay, you pay for how much data you store, and it's basically priced per gigabyte. Now, just 1 second. Power BI decided to come back on top. Okay, now this is an interesting item to understand. So each workspace is charged as a separate topic. Separate service? What I mean by that. So let's say you're actually putting in data from Azure Data Factory, that's considered a service. If you put in data from SQL Server, that's considered a service. VMs is a service. So if you've got multiple services going into log analytics, you are charged per service that you capture data on, right? So you need to be aware of that when you start capturing this data. It may be a good opportunity to say any mission critical information will go into log analytics and everything else can go into storage. Okay, like I was showing you earlier. Okay. So what you can also do, and if I can put this around, to mitigate some of this, you can set the data retention period. So data retention period by default is 31 days. You can reduce that or increase that as you see fit. I've heard of cases where people have set the retention period for log analytics to 2 days, especially when using Synapse Analytics, and everything else goes into storage. Okay. And if you want more information on the cost considerations for log analytics, please use that link. Okay, it'll go into a bit more detail as well. Okay, in summary then, there is a way to do comprehensive monitoring of Azure Data Factory resources for minimal effort. And it doesn't have to be Azure Data Factory, it can be any resource. Okay? The solution I've built is versatile and can be used across multiple different services. And like I said earlier, I built my solution within a day. Right? As a prototype, it's solid enough for me to start working on it. And it can be something I give to my team members or anybody else to actually develop further if they need be. It can definitely be surfaced up to the clients, and it takes away the need for the client to actually contact you or your IT team, support team to see what's happening with a particular project or particular pipeline. Now, I decided to put this last item in there. The reason being, you're capturing all this log information, okay? Think about what you can use it for. You can use it to do not just monitoring, you can actually do capacity planning of it. Now, since you can do capacity planning, there's nothing stopping you actually running machine learning algorithms on top of this, okay? To do maintenance costs, to do, you can, sky's the oyster basically for what you can achieve with this information. And like I said, log analytics and Azure Monitor give you the opportunity to capture information from a wide variety of sources in Azure, which makes it the wide world of logs that you need to understand and that is available and that you can implement in your environment. It is a very, very good way to actually get something up and running instead of writing custom solutions that you used to do previously. And it is very powerful with that regard. Okay. Are there any questions regarding my presentation?
Yeah!